Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking the dramatic, complex, and honestly, just incredibly fascinating evolution of Australia. When we look at Australia today, we see one of the wealthiest, most highly developed nations on the planet, right? Cities that literally top global livability indexes year after year. But the journey to get to this point, it was anything but predictable. We're going to trace how a land of undisturbed ancient tribes transformed into a harsh penal colony and eventually grew into the modern powerhouse we know today. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this transformation, just think about these numbers for a second. Today, female life expectancy in Australia is a world-leading 85.4 years. But jump back to 1870, and it's a completely different story. A newborn was only expected to live to the brutal average age of just 34. 34! The early colonists faced incredibly grueling, punishing labor in an environment that was deeply unforgiving. So how did they bridge that massive gap? Well, let's look at the timeline. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We're covering First Nations and contact, the penal colony era, gold and expansion, federation and the world wars, and finally, a modern multicultural nation. That's about 65,000 years of history to cover, so let's get moving. Section 1. First Nations and European contact. This covers 65,000 years right up to 1788. For the vast majority of that incredible time span, Aboriginal peoples, which included over 500 distinct tribal groups, all with their own unique languages and territories, lived and thrived completely undisturbed. Let's trace how that long isolation eventually ended. Driven by the Great Age of Discovery, European explorers were actually out looking for a theoretical southern landmass to balance out the northern continents. In 1606, Dutch explorer Willem Janszoon made the first documented landfall. Later, in 1642, Abel Tasman reached what we now call Tasmania. But because they didn't find the lucrative spices they were after, European interest basically stalled. That is, until 1770, when British Captain James Cook claimed New South Wales, which ultimately paved the way for the first fleet's arrival in 1778. When these newly arrived European settlers made contact with the indigenous population, the resulting strain was immediate and, frankly, devastating. There were profound cultural misunderstandings right from the start. For example, Aboriginal peoples viewed animals on their land as fair game for hunting, whereas the British settlers viewed this as poaching their private livestock. On top of that, because of 60,000 years of isolation, the indigenous population had virtually no natural immunity to European diseases. To put that tragic reality into perspective, an outbreak of smallpox in 1789 wiped out roughly half of the Aboriginal population in the Sydney region alone. Section 2. The Penal Colony Era. From punishment to settlement. Interestingly enough, the spark that kicked off this era actually came from halfway across the globe, the American Revolution. Losing the American colonies meant Britain suddenly lost its main penal destination, so they had to turn their sights toward Australia. Those early years were absolutely brutal. We're talking incredibly harsh labor and super high mortality rates among the convicts. Social tensions were just a pressure cooker, which led to the first major convict rebellion at Castle Hill in 1804 and even a military coup, the famous Rum Rebellion in 1808. Meanwhile, French expeditions were outmapping the coastline, so Britain aggressively expanded its settlements just to block any competing claims. But over time, under leaders like Governor Lachlan Macquarie, things started to shift. The focus moved away from being just a giant prison and towards building civil infrastructure and a free civilian society. However, that unrelenting push of British settlements onto Aboriginal land inevitably sparked fierce competition over basic resources. This led directly to the Frontier Wars, a truly tragic series of conflicts, spanning from the late 18th right into the early 20th centuries. Aboriginal peoples were fighting desperately to protect their land from interloping settlers. The result was violent confrontations, destroyed crops, and stolen livestock. And as that cycle of violence spiraled, indiscriminate massacres were tragically carried out by both sides across the frontier. Section 3. Gold, Rebellion, and Expansion. Forging an Identity. Now, what's really interesting here is how a single event can literally flip the script for an entire continent. In 1851, Edward Hargreaves discovered gold near Bathurst, New South Wales, and that triggered the biggest gold rush in Australian history. The sheer scale of what happened next is mind-blowing. In just a 10-year window, the population basically tripled, exploding from 430,000 to over 1.17 million. Miners flooded into the gold fields of New South Wales and Victoria like it was nobody's business. And they weren't just coming from neighboring colonies. People poured in from Britain, America, China, across the globe, really, all looking to strike it rich. But that kind of mass influx, it brings some severe growing pains. The easy surface gold quickly dried up, and miners found themselves hit with heavy-handed local taxes and zero political representation. All that tension boiled over in the 1854 Eureka Stockade Rebellion. Now, the rebel miners were defeated militarily, but they won massive public sympathy and were actually acquitted at trial. It was in that very moment that the core Australian value of egalitarianism, this fierce demand for a fair go and equality before the law, became a permanent hallmark of the culture. Of course, while the later 19th century brought a broader economic boom, not everyone struck it rich. A lot of the rural working class was left entirely behind. Driven by poverty, some folks turned to illicit wealth, becoming bushrangers. These outlaws roamed the countryside, robbing stagecoaches and banks. And the most famous of them, Ned Kelly, actually became a romanticized folk hero. Their stories really cemented this distinct, anti-authoritarian national identity that felt very separate from traditional British colonial rule. Section 4, Federation and World Wars. The nation tested. On January 1st, 1901, the colonies officially federated into the Commonwealth of Australia. But one of their very first highly restrictive moves was implementing the White Australia policy. This was essentially an apartheid-like system, explicitly designed to block non-European migration, aimed entirely at preserving the predominantly British demographic makeup of the country.
Barely a decade after Federation, this young nation was thrust straight into the horrors of the First World War. When Britain called, Australia answered. And the casualty rates were absolutely staggering. Out of a relatively small national population, 324,000 Australians served overseas. Tragically, 60,000 were killed and another 150,000 were wounded. That was the highest casualty rate of any Allied force in the entire war. The legendary bravery and sacrifice of the Anzac troops at Gallipoli and the Western Front heavily defined the national psyche for generations.
On the heels of those devastating wartime losses came the severe economic depression of the 1930s. It was a really bleak time, but Australians actually found unity and a huge psychological boost in some amazing cultural and sporting milestones. The founding of Qantas back in 1920 was pioneering immense aviation feats, and sports legends like Don Bradman, who was setting all-time cricket records alongside the champion racehorse Phar Lap dominating at tracks, they gave the public some much-needed cheer and a real sense of national pride during those incredibly dark days. So the crucial point here is a massive geopolitical pivot. When the Second World War erupted, Australia's geographical reality finally caught up with it. There was a dramatic strategic shift. Before World War II, Australia relied entirely on Britain for defense. But after suffering direct attacks on its own soil, including those devastating Japanese bombing raids on Darwin and a literal submarine attack in Sydney Harbor, Australia completely flipped its strategy, realigning its Pacific alliances directly toward the United States. Section 5. A modern multicultural nation. Boom and reconciliation. Following World War II, there was a massive influx of European migrants. This surge was so huge that it effectively rendered that old white Australia policy totally redundant. Plus, it rapidly accelerated a booming manufacturing sector and helped build much-needed modern infrastructure. As Australia stepped out of its isolation and forged this new, independent identity, it finally had to look inward and address its own deeply flawed domestic history. During the late 20th century, there was a vital policy shift towards officially acknowledging the historical injustices committed against Indigenous Aboriginal peoples. Initiating a formal reconciliation process became a major focus, which was a really critical step in addressing centuries of marginalization and maltreatment. And these modern landmarks perfectly illustrate how Australia showcased its transformation to the rest of the world. The grand opening of the Sydney Opera House in 1973, and then hosting the wildly successful Olympic Games in the year 2000, presented a confident, vibrant nation. It cemented Australia's reputation, no longer just a remote colonial outpost, but a highly livable, wealthy, and dynamic cultural powerhouse. From a vast network of undisturbed ancient tribal lands, through the really grim reality of penal colonies, to the wild gold rushes that birthed a defiant egalitarian spirit, Australia's history is an absolute masterclass in adaptation. Which leaves us with this final thought.
As our world grows increasingly complex, how will Australia's unique legacy of surviving harsh environments and overcoming deep geopolitical isolation continue to shape its future on the global stage? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.